Well, old blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way, crying, Lord, have mercy on me. Well, in my God's Bible, the word proclaims that Christ went a-healing the crippled and the lame. He gave to the poor and the needy bread, healing the sick and raising the dead. And then when he came to Galilee, he passed by a man that could not see. Well, the man was blind, he was blind from birth. They tell me that his name was Blind Bartimaeus, singing, oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way, crying, Lord, have mercy on me. Well, when Bartimaeus heard that the Lord was nigh, he fell on his knees and began to cry. And, oh, thou man from Galilee, crying, great God Almighty, have mercy on me. Crying, oh, Lord, Mary's baby. Oh, Lord, Son of David. Oh, Lord, bleeding Lamb. Oh, my Lord, from in Bethlehem, singing, oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way, crying, Lord, have mercy on me. Then my Lord, he stopped and he turned around. He saw blind Bartimaeus on the ground, and he touched his eyes with the palm of his hand. Blind Bartimaeus, like a natural man, he cried, thank God, Mary's baby. Thank God, Son of David. Thank God, bleeding Lamb. Oh, my Lord, from Bethlehem, singing, oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way, crying, Lord, have mercy on me. Well, oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Blind Bartimaeus stood on the way. Oh, blind Bartimaeus stood on the way, crying, Lord, have mercy on me. Well, his name was Bartimaeus, or Bartimaeus, as the song goes. I'm going to use Bartimaeus. Why do we know his name? When all of the other blind people that Jesus healed, we don't know their name. We don't know who they are. Now, we don't know the name of most of the people, almost all the people that Jesus healed. We know Lazarus. He was a dear friend of Jesus. We know Mary Magdalene. She was a disciple. But the others are nameless. So why do we know his name? This blind man has a name, and it was remembered. You know, Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels. It was written maybe even 30 years before the other Gospels were written. And so it's under, you know, and a lot of scholars think that Mark was writing from Peter's recollection. We don't know if that's true, but early Christian tradition says that. And so it's understandable we don't get many specific names of people Jesus healed. He healed a lot of people. It'd be pretty difficult to remember their names. But Bartimaeus was a name that was remembered. And in fact, it was not only remembered, his name was not only remembered, it was remembered where they found him. He was sitting by the walls of Jericho. You remember Jericho? Joshua and his armies circled the walls, and a trumpet sounded, and the walls of Jericho came a tumbling down. Jericho was known to be a city of sin. So blind Bartimaeus was sitting by the walls of the city of sin. They were known for their idolatry. That's what Jericho was known for. But let's be honest, all sin is a form of idolatry. Because idolatry is anything that you put in front of God, and sin puts yourself and your desires in front of God. And if you put something in front of God, it blocks your view of God. That anytime you put something in front of anything, it blocks your view of that thing. And this is how idolatry works. So if I put my money before God, it blocks my view of God. If I put my recreational activities before God, it blocks my view of God. If I put my career before God, it blocks my view of God. If I put my family or anything or myself or anything I love before God, it blocks my view of God. So idolatry causes spiritual blindness. Idolatry causes spiritual blindness because it blocks our view of God. Blind Bartimaeus was physically blind, and he was surrounded by a city of spiritual blindness. And he's a beggar. Spiritually blind people don't beg. Spiritually blind people don't think they need to beg. Begging is humiliating. One must stoop to beg. Spiritually blind people don't want to stoop because they don't think they need to. But blind Bartimaeus begs because he has no other choice. Not just because he needs to eat, but because he knows he cannot help himself. So the first step to spiritual freedom is begging. Begging is an essential part of the spiritual life. The Protestant reformer Martin Luther said, "We are all beggars." This is true. When sin has hold of us, when we are blinded by our sin, the only way out is to start begging. Sin is addiction. I mean, we keep sinning because we can't stop. We can't seem to stop it. And anything you can't stop, at least by your own efforts, is addiction. And the only way to escape addiction is to realize that you can't do it on your own. And you got to start begging for help. Ask any drug or alcohol addict. If you've got somebody in your family, you know you've got to first realize that you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You need help. We can't solve our sin addiction by ourselves. And this is what we mean when we say that salvation is by grace alone. We cannot save ourselves. Blind Bartimaeus knew he needed help. Lord, have mercy. And when we name prayer requests in church, we say, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We are begging in church. We are begging for God's help. But do you know what happened when Bartimaeus cried for Jesus' help? The people told him to shut up. The people around him sternly and unsympathetically told Bartimaeus to shut up. When you are living in a city of sin, when you are surrounded by sin, you should not expect the support of people around you. The city of sin protects its own interest. Having someone around who realizes that they need to escape from their sin and who musters the courage to beg out of it, they are a threat to the city of sin. You're not going to get help from the people around you. People who are mired in their own junk are threatened when you try to deal with your junk. You ever tried to go on a diet and the people around you are constantly shoving food in your face? Or even saying, it's okay to splurge every once in a while. I will never forget, or rather Julie will never let me forget, the first time she went on Weight Watchers. We were back when we were in our 20s and living in Alaska. And she came home from a Weight Watchers meeting one night and walked in the door of our apartment to find me eating from a very large bag of M&Ms. You know, the party bags they put in the bowls. She was not happy with me, and she said, "Do you really have to do that in front of me?" And I said, "Well, I'm just trying to help you steel your resolve." Guys, have you ever done or said anything so stupid? That's not even in my top 20. Anytime you try to do better or something or someone always seems to get in the way, often it's the people who are supposed to love us the most. Bishop Robert Barron, whose insights admittedly I'm using in this sermon, He often quotes the old spiritual saying, the road to healing is always blocked. You know how you can spot the people who are trying to love like Jesus? They are the people who don't try to block you from doing what's in your best interest. But Blind Bartimaeus, he didn't let those people keep him from begging for help. He persisted. He persevered. He is so desperate to be healed that he didn't let the blockers block his view of God. Bartimaeus refused to let the blockers block his view of God. You know, healing comes through perseverance. I think of all the cancer patients I've pastored who take every treatment, even alternative treatments. They pray every prayer and they fight like hell to be healed. If we want to be free from the sin that keeps us spiritually blind, we must persist. We must persevere. We cannot give up. We must continue to beg and plead and ask for help from God and from other Christians. Holiness is more than anything perseverance. Holiness is not, and it's never been, about staying free from sin. That's not what holiness is about. Holiness is persevering after you fall and fall and fall again. Keep persevering, keep begging, because it was Bartimaeus' loud and incessant begging that got Jesus to stop and say, call him here. Jesus didn't say, bring him here. He didn't say, come here. He said, call him here. Jesus was calling blind Bartimaeus. So the disciples called the blind man, and this is what they said to him. They said, take heart. Take heart. Get up, Jesus is calling you. They told blind Bartimaeus to take heart. Have hope, Bartimaeus. Have hope. The call of Jesus in our life is a call to hope. We who follow Christ, we are not a people of cynicism, or we are not a people of fear. When Jesus calls us, he calls us to hope. And then the reading says, blind Bartimaeus threw off his cloak. He threw it off. He threw off the cloak of sin that surrounds him. And Bartimaeus throwing off his cloak is far more significant than we read at face value. You know why? Because in the early church, if you went up for baptism, you removed your cloak. Yes, the whole thing. And you went down into the water. I'm not kidding. Naked and all, you went down into the water. You threw off your cloak. And then you sprang up from the water. And they gave you a new cloak, a white cloak that looks almost exactly like the one I usually wear on Sunday, which is why I wear it. The new cloak they were given was a sign of their new life, their new hope. So Bartimaeus tosses his cloak away, never to return to it, and then he springs up toward Jesus. He springs up. You know, sin drags us down. Being surrounded by sin drags us down. It makes us slump. It robs us of our hope. When we toss away that cloak of sin, we gain a spring in our step, like Bartimaeus. We slump no longer, and instead we leap. Ask anyone who is in addiction recovery. There's a spring in their step that wasn't there when they were using. So when Bartimaeus gets to Jesus, Jesus asks, what do you want me to do for you? We've heard this question before. We heard it last week. This is the question Jesus asked James and John last week. James and John answered Jesus' question by asking for more power. The disciples, the ones who already answered Jesus' call, wanted more for themselves. How interesting is it that the blind beggar gets the answer to Jesus' question right when the disciples don't? Do we have enough beggars in our churches these days? Between last week's reading and this week's reading, it is apparent that James and John were the blind ones. Indeed, I'm not sure that blind Bartimaeus was ever really blind. And finally, Jesus says to Bartimaeus, he says, go, your faith has made you well. This may be the most misunderstood thing Jesus ever said. Because we think When Jesus says, your faith has made you well, what we think is that blind Bartimaeus' faith is what healed him from physical blindness. And too many Christians think that if we pray to God and he doesn't heal us, we don't have enough faith. Can't tell you how many times church members have come up to me over the decades of my ministry and have said to me, I prayed and prayed for the Lord to heal me, and he hasn't. I must not have enough faith. Jesus is the one who healed Bartimaeus of his physical blindness, not his faith. Bartimaeus' faith healed him of his spiritual blindness. When Jesus says our faith makes us well, he's saying that our faith makes our heart and souls well. The measure of our faith has no bearing on whether or not we are healed. Our faith heals our sin sickness. Our faith makes us well from that. It makes us spiritually well. Our faith is what helps us to stand up against the city of sin when they are trying to pull us back inside the walls of Jericho. So after blind Bartimaeus was healed, Mark tells us he regained his sight and he followed Jesus on the way. He followed Jesus on the way. That's an important phrase. Do you know what Christianity was called in the earliest days? It was called the way. It wasn't called Christianity. It was called the way. Blind Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way. When blind Bartimaeus was freed from the city of sin and healed of his blindness, he went and followed Jesus on the way. He became a disciple, and maybe that's why his name was remembered. He became a disciple. He became a part of Jesus' church because you can't stay out of the city of sin without being surrounded by others who are also on the way. Oh, blind Bartimaeus, blinded by the sin that surrounded him. He begs to be free of it. He gets shouted down by those who don't want him to change, but he persists in his begging. Jesus then calls Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus throws off his cloak of sin and springs toward Jesus. He begs to be healed, and Jesus heals him. And then he follows Jesus on the way. That sounds like salvation to me. Let us take a moment of silence.